Welcome to Top 5 Solo Games. I'm J. Allen Ryker, horror author and solo board game madman. And today we're doing something different. We're talking about my gamified writing process. BLD the Gamer wondered about the relationship between me being a writer and a gamer. It's a good question since I start every video mentioning those two things about myself, but I actually hadn't put a ton of thought into it before. It's funny the things that you are oblivious to about yourself that other people pick up as being obvious. So the funny thing is that the two things are actually pretty closely connected. I used to struggle to come up with fiction ideas. I had a contract to write one novel and one novella a year, and it stressed me out to no end to come up with 2 ideas a year. I am not one of these writers who started writing because they just have thousands of ideas bouncing around in their head and they'll go crazy if they don't get these ideas out. Rather, I'm a writer in the same way that I enjoy games that give me little bits of flavor text and let me piece them together. I find that really satisfying. It almost feels like a puzzle to find out how all these disparate little bits are connected. The problem is taking that quality about myself and being able to use it to actually produce long works of fiction. I tried some different prompt systems, but it was never enough. I would use quotations, cliches, post secrets. Do you remember post secrets? Those were really useful because it's always good for a character in a story to have a secret. Sometimes I could mash them together in such a way that they were enough to fuel an entire story, but usually not. I would spend just hours struggling with this. And then a few years ago, I did find the tools to fully gamify my writing process. And those are things that are actually often used by, say, dungeon masters or just people who like storytelling games. In this video, I used the story engine and Rory's story cubes to create a concept. Those are 2 of my most often used tools to come up with the initial concept. And it's something that I do literally every time that I start a new project, whether it be a screenplay, a novel, or a novella. So anyway, let's jump in and I will show you the entire process. So the tool that we are going to be using today is the story engine. I use this one a lot. This is actually my primary plot concept generation tool. I think that it's very flexible and it gives you a lot of options without it being overwhelming. You'll see what I mean. First, let's take a look at the agent card. This will tell us about our protagonist. So this is from, see a little gas mask here, this is from their post-apocalyptic expansion. They have a core set and then they have different genres. I have them mixed in because I found that most of them work some of the time. And especially because I typically write horror, you'll see the cards from genres that are kind of tangentially related, that I keep those in my main set. So here we have a Reaver, a Warlord, a Junk Seller, a Sawbones. Okay. I think that there are some really interesting options here. I think that maybe a Reaver and a Warlord are my top. I'll leave those kind of angled towards the bottom, but we'll see. So let's take a look at the engine card next. This is from the Fantasy expansion. We have once to stop an enemy from reaching, once to obtain a rare spell component from. Um, I don't know that I am wanting necessarily something magical. So right now I'm leaning towards wants to stop an enemy from reaching. But that could change, and if it does, then we can flip it around. We'll take a look at the anchor card. So this is what is being acted upon or with: a book, a library, a word, a riddle. I love these options. Maybe it's just the fact that I obviously like the written word a lot as a writer, but I'm not 100% sure it works really good with this protagonist. We'll have to think about this. I don't really want anything to do with a riddle, so it'd be a library or a book. Maybe this will end up being a post-apocalyptic tale. Could be interesting. Okay, let's take a look at the conflict card. I think that this is one of the things that sets apart the story engine from other prompt systems, is that it gives you the conflict. What is stopping? So you know what the protagonist wants, but that would be a paragraph if something weren't stopping them from getting it. So let's take a look at our options. But it will mean breaking a promise, but they will have to keep a promise they've been avoiding. Some definite dramatic potential there in either one of those. Okay, so I have an idea here, but it's going to mean using a different structure than the standard draw for the story engine. I would have no problem with a warlord being the protagonist, but I have an idea which would require them being the antagonist. So in order to do that, you don't need the conflict card, because what we are going to do is we are going to have the conflict be between two people with opposing desires. So the warlord wants to stop an enemy from reaching a library. That is true. On this side, I thought, okay, maybe it's just a guy. I'm in post-apocalyptic mindset due to this being a post-apocalyptic card, and I immediately thought of just like as this, say, like Mad Max from Fury Road, the way that he's almost a non-character. He's a stand-in, just a dude, And I thought, well, this could just be a dude. This could just be a person who obviously wants something that every person would want. Then, though, I drew a card, and it's pretty wild because it fit right away. So I drew this agent card: a bookworm, a student, an amateur, an apprentice. And a bookworm just jumped right out at me because the warlord wants to stop someone from reaching a library. So so the bookworm is the protagonist. This, I'm just going to use let's glare. This, I'm just going to use the inverse of it. Although usually it's more interesting if they each have their own motivation and you just figure out why they're opposed, rather than having the same motivation but one of them has the opposite. But I think in this case, it works well that the warlord wants the bookworm to not reach a library, and the bookworm wants to reach the library. The junk seller caught my attention here. So I think the junk seller is going to be the catalyst for the story. The junk seller is going to have found some books. The junk seller is illiterate. Most people at this time are. The bookworm is a rare person who literacy has been passed down, maybe in her family. And so she's always scraping up anything she can to buy books from the junk seller. And what the junk seller gives her is information on a water purification system. You can see where my head was at with the Mad Max angle. This is a very untraditional draw. It has a lot to keep track of because I'm using 2 on this one. Couple here. This is for each character, but inverted. Yeah, but what matters is that it gives you an idea in the end. Like, make up your own rules. Use the prompt the way that you need to. I'd say struggle with it a little bit in the way that it's presented to you and see what gets knocked loose. But when something gets knocked loose, all bets are off. All right, so I like this concept. It's currently a very straightforward story. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be good. The complications may come. It's the what we have here is the catalyst of a journey, and the challenges met along the way may provide enough. But let's take a look at sprinkling a little extra seasoning onto this concept using the story engine aspect cards. These are adjectives that you can attach in different places that will let you see the cards that you have down on the table already in a different way, one that might be better for your story. All right, so with the first, this is from the horror set, you can tell from the little skull, evil repelling, feral, immoral, strange. Okay. I think this bookworm, obviously, in a world where most people can't read, a literate person is going to be unusual. But I think that this could mean that we make them very quirky. Do you go with a stereotypical over-the-top nerd concept? It could be interesting because when you don't see that often in the post-apocalyptic setting, especially not from the protagonist, instead of some like mad inventor, let's say. Or maybe they're strange in some other way. But I think that this is, if in my head, this is a post-apocalyptic story. I think you could take it you can maybe put it in other genres if you tweaked it. But in my head, this is a post-apocalyptic story. And this is a good reminder to lean into the weirdness, lean into the possible, society collapsed. They have new myths, they have new assumptions. They don't see cause and effect maybe in the same way. So they've probably developed new rituals. They have a different culture. And I think that this is one of the things where if you take a standard story, it's fine for something to be standard. Sometimes it's just a solid framework for you to hang your really original ideas on. All right, let's see what else we got here. Nebulous, desolate, dashing, cowardly. Okay, well, it's a desolate library. I don't know that really adds anything to it. Is that the best use of this card? Actually, I mean, the library obviously being someplace abandoned that the junk seller was raiding, it's going to be desolate. We know this. I think that a dashing warlord could be really interesting, charming, not a over-the-top brute, but someone who retains control through their charisma. Here we have forgotten, holy, obsessive, belligerent. Well, the bookworm could be obsessive. The library is certainly forgotten. Should it be a strange, obsessive bookworm? Yeah, I think so. And I think that what this means, I think that where this obsessiveness comes in is that they love books, but they are going to be required over the course of the story to sacrifice in order to achieve their goal. All right, so the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to roll some of these Rory story cubes. These are another good way to add some twists to your story, to give your mind something to chew on that makes you see things a little differently. Just some extra random elements. Okay, so it's funny, I rolled this very recently. Snake eye on a die, so that would be bad luck. The boiling cauldron, it looks magical to me, though so far this story doesn't have any magic in it. Gears, that could stand for any number of things. Machinery, a system that's finely tuned, something moving ahead unstoppably. Here we have what looks to me like a dungeon opening. But it's barred. The way is barred, so it's I guess a door that's being impeded, and then a sword. What can we do with this? Funny enough, while I think that we can use these dice to describe the story that we've already created, they don't offer me anything particularly revelatory. So the bookworm should have plenty of bad luck while she's on her way. The warlord sends armed warriors after her. The goal of this getting to the library is that it's a library at like a water processing facility that's fallen into, obviously it's no longer operational, but there are books there that describe the water purification process and machines that could be used to help provide fresh water, which is lacking in this particular post-apocalypse. And the way should be barred. So, like I said, I'm not seeing anything here. I tried to consider it from different angles. Like, does this mean that the bookworm is well armed and a good fighter? That could be. Is it the warlord who's unlucky? Well, they're unlucky that their power may be about to be taken from them. But I don't think that weakening them by making them unlucky would make the story more interesting. It's the protagonist who we want to have all the complications and problems. And the warlord ultimately faces something like that, but it's at the end when their failings lead to their downfall. as they're already in a position of power. All right, so I've got some ideas here, clearly. So I'm going to write this concept up, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so I have written up a plot concept. I think it's pretty strong. I think that it is a bit generic, but that it is the details that will make it pop. And honestly, I think that those are sometimes the most fun stories to write, where you can let the structure, you can feel secure in the structure and um, play around with other aspects. Of course, having a very unconventional or very twist filled plot can also be fun to write. It's less of my specialty, though, I've got to admit. So, the concept I came up with: a strange, obsessive bookworm wants to reach a library. A dashing warlord wants to stop an enemy from reaching a library. The world is in a stereotypical post-apocalyptic state, with little fresh water and lots of violence. A charming warlord rules over his people with guile and cunning. He doesn't prove himself to be a terrible person off the bat, charming even the audience. So the way I would write this is that it wouldn't be immediately apparent that the warlord is actually the antagonist. I would maybe write them as seeming like a supportive character. In fact, I think that maybe the protagonist works closely with the warlord. The warlord recognizes that although the protagonist is kind of maybe not too useful in as a like say as a warrior or as a worker, but they are, due to how strange and book obsessed they are, but that they are a useful resource and a unique resource. So at first it may seem like the protagonist and the antagonist are actually going to work together. I think that once the protagonist reads the book, finds out that it's a manual for an instruction manual for water purification equipment, and then rushes to tell the warlord about it, that's when the warlord shows his true colors. He kills the junk seller who he was speaking to about the goods that he brought, and therefore who heard what the facility that he was at actually is, that it's a water purification facility. And the warlord tries to kill the protagonist. The warlord has control of an extremely rare freshwater spring, and he realizes that his grip on the people would slip if they didn't need to rely on him for the fresh water supply. So, of course, the story would end there if he was successful in killing the protagonist, so he doesn't. Somehow the protagonist escapes. And I don't know if that could be tied to books or not. It'd be interesting to try to make a lot of different things in the story tie back to books. There could be an early scene where the protagonist is reading some sort of adventure book where the character escapes with an act of daring do and then manages to, like, say the protagonist clumsily reproduces this to escape the warlord. And throughout the adventure, the knowledge from books saves the protagonist, so that's almost their power. It's a little bit expected, but it still could be satisfying. So regardless of how you decide to go with that, the protagonist escapes and goes on a journey. There are lots of complications along the way. They meet bad people on the road. They meet good people on the road who they want to help and can. Maybe good people who they want to help, but they can't. It would be you can show a real moral struggle if they realize that the most important thing is for them to survive and figure out how to purify the poisonous water that surrounds them. That could lead to a lot of really intense, interesting decisions for the protagonist to make. So I also think that it would, because this protagonist, remember that we applied the adjective obsessive to them, that if at some point, and this would tie really neatly into the idea that their books help them along the way, that they have to sacrifice some books somehow. I don't know how that looks. I don't know what that entails, but um, they could come to the realization that the books aren't going to be useful if there's no one around to read them. They maybe it would be that if they are using the knowledge of the books, then the books themselves don't matter as much. Of course, it goes against the idea of the knowledge within the books being transferable from person to person being important. Um, but I do think that that would be a good moment of crisis for the protagonist. And so, yeah, I think that there are a lot of interesting angles in this story that looks very traditional. I think that I personally would write it probably with a considerable amount of humor. I don't think I would go for a grim, dark post-apocalyptic story, especially with the charming warlord and the quirky bookworm. But there's no reason why you couldn't make it a serious uh, book. It could be as big of a downer as The Road, if you wanted to. So from there, I will take that concept and I might turn it into a screenplay where I will take it and I will put it through the standard 15 plot beats. And that provides enough structure to where I can take the concept and usually turn it into an entire 3-act story. But I have also started playing with a really in-depth gamified plot generating tool called the Adventure Crafter. If you're familiar with solo role playing, then you're probably familiar with the Mythic Game Master engine. I think is what it's called. It's called Mythic for sure. And this is another one of their products. And it's kind of amazing what like a dynamic and exciting plot you can create with it for any storytelling medium. And it's good. I've found it's very useful for longer stories because it causes you to create diverging paths instead of being, whereas with screenplays, it is fine for things to sort of barrel ahead. That, though, would be another video, probably a really long one, and I would only make it if people were really interested, which I'm not thinking that people probably are that interested. But I do hope that this quick look into my process was interesting. Thanks a lot to BLD the Gamer for the topic. He couldn't have possibly known he would get this long of an answer, but thank you. And of course, I hope that everyone has a great day and keeps playing solo.